I am privileged to introduce our distinguished panelist and moderator. Ernest J. Barthélemy is Division Chief of Neurosurgery, State University of New York, Downstate Health Sciences University, and founding president of the Society of Haitian Neuroscientists. Joseph P. Gone is Professor of Anthropology and Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard University, and Faculty Director of the Harvard University Native American Program. Lebohang Leopoldo Peko is Senior Research Fellow and Political Economist at the Trade Collective. She will be joining the panel virtually. Our moderator is Michelle Morse, Chief Medical Officer and Deputy Commissioner, Center for Health Equity and Community Wellness, New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and Assistant Professor at the Harvard Medical School. I turn the panel over to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Professor Achimpong, and thank you to the organizers of the conference today, the conversation, let's say. I would love to invite the panelists up to the stage. Well, the floor, let's not say the stage. And I say the floor because we are really looking forward to dialogue. I think even though we are in a very fancy space and place at the moment, our hope for this conversation is that it be very open, very honest, and very critical, frankly. I'm not sure if we have our colleague Lebohang online just yet, but hopefully she can hear us. And I might ask, actually, if you don't mind, can I stop here? Okay. So I just wanted to share a couple of brief remarks before I jump into the questions. I want to start by saying that all of us in this conversation, and I think most of you, are in some way connected to public health or medical or social praxis. And it's so important for us to exchange ideas, critiques, concerns in a complex moment like we're in right now. I think there has been thankfully increasing scrutiny about the patterns of who thrives and who doesn't, and what the roots of those patterns are, and how they're connected so deeply to our history, our choices, our social hierarchy, and many, many generations of patterns preceding us. As we know, how we define the problem is often how we define the solutions. And so we want to, in the conversation today, be clear, specific, rigorous in our language, and really bring a powerful analysis to this question of what does decoloniality in global health look like? So I'm going to actually start with a definition. This is just one definition, and the panelists are going to respond with some reflections to this definition in just a moment. So again, one example, one definition. In their book on decoloniality, scholars Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh define the term as a form of struggle and survival, an existence-based response and practice against the colonial matrix of power in all its dimensions. Decoloniality denotes ways of thinking, knowing, being, and doing that started with, but also precede the colonial enterprise and invasion. It implies the recognition and undoing of the hierarchical structures of race, gender, heteropatriarchy, and class that continue to control life, knowledge, spirituality, and thought structures that are intertwined with and made up of global capitalism and Western modernity. They also characterize decoloniality as undoing and redoing. It is praxis. The goal of decoloniality is delinking in order to engage in forms of life that we like to preserve, rather than the hostage of modernity's designs and desires, and of nationalist selection of the past and the nation, as well as cultural de-Westernization and political reemergence. A lot of words. I suspect a lot of thoughts are already coming up for many of you. And I'm going to kick us off with some reflections from the panelists. I'm going to move over here. And so I'm going to kick us off by asking our panelists to take a couple of minutes to ground us in your perspective on decoloniality and how you see it as distinct or different from decolonization. And I'm going to ask Ernest to go first, and then Joseph, and then hopefully Lebohang will go third. Just a few minutes of your reflections on that.
Sure, thank you. I'm honored by the opportunity to be amongst friends and luminaries in this field. And I'm in this conversation as a Black American neurosurgeon and a son of Haitian immigrants. So firstly, I have directly experienced racism in medicine, both overtly as well as in its many subtle forms. And currently, I have the opportunity to serve a large Black community. Also deals with impoverishment, other areas of social inequity at a trauma center in Brooklyn, New York. And sometimes, when my colleagues and I strive to provide the standard of care to our patient population, the structural barriers to doing that can seem insurmountable. And yet, I'm often struck by how similar those barriers are to barriers I've encountered in the global health space and the work that I've had the opportunity to do in developing countries like Haiti, where my parents are from, and Cuba, among other places. And there is this inescapable link, this colonial legacy, the impacts of which I think are incalculably huge, but we need to find a way to grapple with this. So Paul Farmer always reminded us that we start the social diagnosis with the history of the present illness, right? And I think certainly those of us who are physicians, or even if you're not a physician, you can immediately appreciate how critically important it is to deeply and broadly understand that history if you're going to find an effective and sustainable solution. So this is the conversation of the day if we are to advance health equity. And I'll end with the distinction between decolonization and decoloniality. I think several of us think of decolonization as a period of independence movements in most of the countries of Africa, okay, with the salient exception of Haiti, which started about 150 years prior to that, right? But otherwise, the 1960s and 1970s are what we think of as the decolonization movement, whereas I think decoloniality invites us to appreciate the living legacy of colonialism that we're still dealing with in all of those countries, as well as in Haiti and certainly here in the United States.
Thanks for that. I appreciate the opportunity to provide a perspective that contrasts a little bit based on the experiences of Indigenous people in the United States and other places around the world. So I'm a social scientist, psychologist, trained clinically, but really engaged in research. I'm an enrolled member or tribal citizen of the Aani-Grovant people of the Fort Belknap Reservation in north central Montana. And my work has been dedicated to trying to think and, in the end, rethink how mental health services might be better tailored to be helping to my people and other Indigenous people in the United States. There have been a couple of key moments in my career where things have become really salient that the typical conventional way of doing business might not apply the best. I remember one that's quite personal. My younger brother, who sadly is no longer with us today, approached me and said he was going through a really tough time, lots of struggles. He didn't really know what to do. Could I do therapy with him? I was a graduate student at the time, training in therapy. But of course, the first lesson of therapy is you can't do it with people you know or are close to or related to. There has to be a kind of professional distance in the way we're taught. And being a graduate student and never having thought to imagine this kind of request, I kind of stumbled and stammered and made some kind of comment about how it's really not done that way, and maybe the IHS counselors could be helpful, at which point he completely closed down and sort of said, "Why would you think I would trust anyone outside of this family with my problems?" and turned away. And this is just one of an enormous variety of experiences, orientations, and perspectives that complicate the psychological mental health services endeavor when it comes to some of our people. And so we often hear enthusiasm for decolonizing global health, decolonizing public health, decolonizing mental health. And I just want to remind us that there are varieties of colonialism. There's the kind of colonization that we've just heard about, which had to do with a moment of decolonization in which people who had occupied for a long time were sort of sent home. But the condition of the United States and of Canada and lots of the former, British Commonwealth nations are ones in which settler colonialism is probably the variety of consideration. And it has to do with the fact that folks came from wherever and plan to stay and have stayed. And so there is no formal decolonization from that. The settlers and their descendants are never going back, and it changes the dynamics of how we think about decolonization in such circumstances. In fact, it makes them quite difficult. It's almost a creative, perhaps even poetic endeavor to imagine what decolonization looks like under the conditions of settler colonialism. And I don't have the imagination to really tell you what that looks like. What I will say is that there are indigenous scholars who have been very active in indigenous studies who invited us to worry that the term decolonization has been conscripted for a bunch of, anti-racist struggles, emancipatory struggles, liberatory struggles of all kinds, that completely forget that indigenous land has been occupied, stolen, and is still settled on in many ways that are illegal and unethical and in need of remedy and repair. And so the call from, say, Eve Tuck is decolonization is not a metaphor. Don't use it for your emancipatory struggles. We need to reserve that for the fact that indigenous lands continue to be occupied. So in that sense, I really appreciate the shift to decoloniality, which has to do with kind of a state of being that probably all of us encounter, whether it's we benefit from true decolonization or we're in settler colonial situations, which has to do with a state of being that is shaped by these legacies and histories, and that presents all kinds of constraints and limitations, and indeed psychological constraints, such as not only deep senses of shame and inferiority, but also a kind of paralysis that can come with certain mental health problems that accompany colonial subjugation, like addiction and trauma and suicide, the sort of things that we see fall out of conditions of oppression all over the world. And so the opportunity to think about how to enter into decoloniality is really welcome. So thanks for that.
Thank you. And I think we have Lebohang online. Hopefully you can hear us, Lebohang. If you want to unmute and share your initial reflections on this question of what does decoloniality mean to you? How might it be distinct from decolonization? Bless you. Anything you'd like to share for a few opening remarks? You're welcome to join.
Thanks, Michelle, and to the colleagues. It's good to use virtual spaces because we can be in rooms together, even across great distances. So I think I want to begin by segueing into affirming everything that my colleagues have said, and also segueing into a problematic or a provocation. And I think it's around terminology. So if we understand colonization as the occupation, the total occupation of lands, of languages, of culture, and the extraction of archives, of histories, her stories, of people, of geologies and geographies as well. And if we understand it as the complete erasure and the impulse to remove all that is indigenous to a space and a place across time, and it doesn't need to be linear, then I suppose then we can appreciate then coloniality as the ongoing ontological, epistemic, and violent economic, cultural, linguistic manifestation of the same. And one of the concerns that I've had recently is in the colonization of coloniality and decoloniality. So one example is this notion of apartheid, vaccine apartheid that emerged over the last couple of years during the distribution of the COVID vaccine, or the lack thereof, which is a story for another day or later in this conversation. And the concern that I raised there and that I'll raise here is that when we speak about a construct like apartheid, apart from being, I think, incredibly conceptually lazy, it means that we're taking a construct similar to one like coloniality or colonization, and we're not giving it the political power and meaning and potency of what it was and was not, what it is and is not, and what it did and did not do, and the way that it has been memorialized on Black and brown bodies. And I think the other piece of this is that if we appreciate that apartheid is an ongoing phenomena, it is not over. We can't speak of post-apartheid. We cannot speak of the notion that the racialized inequalities that we're experiencing, the social apartness, the political, financial, and economic destitution of African people and the African majority in this country are in fact over, and that these are colonial realities and colonial factors. So it's not in the same way that it is not accurate to characterize a country like South Africa as a post-apartheid state. It is not a decolonized state, and I don't view it as a decolonized space. I view it as a compromised position that was negotiated into existence for a whole bunch of compromised reasons. So if we speak of a construct of apartheid and then we try to superimpose it onto financial apartheid, vaccine apartheid, climate apartheid, as though the original construction of apartheid has itself been resolved, we do it a great disservice. So I would view coloniality and colonization and decoloniality as constructs and phenomena which are in constant dialectical tension with each other. Because in as much as we would like to view coloniality as a linear project that is constantly moving forward, there are always factors, constraints, demands of white supremacy and power that always want to retain, reinstate, reinscript other forms of colonialism and coloniality, other forms of occupation, financial occupation, policy occupation, discursive occupation, and so forth. And this is really a global project that is epitomized by the US imperial state complex, by the European Union imperial state complex, and to a much lesser extent by the sorts of junior adjacent supremacist powers that are also trying to gain ascendancy. So I view coloniality as a tension with which we are wrestling with an endpoint which is not finite and which is not clear, particularly because the language and the processing is constantly being derailed, reconscripted, remarginalized, and redefined in ways that are often perverse and far away from the radical and important underpinnings of Black and brown power from which they emerged in the first place.
Wow. Lebahang, you're getting applause in the room. I hope you could hear it. And hopefully everyone online heard it as well. What an incredible way to start this conversation today. I can't thank all of the panelists enough for just going straight for the heart of the issue immediately. It gives us more time to be in dialogue, so get your questions ready. I can see questions on your faces already in the room. But the next round of question that I want to put forward for the panelists to respond to and to share your reflections on. So we said we want to talk about decoloniality. We want to be clear about our language. We also said we want to talk about some examples of decolonial work. And then we also really, again, want to be in dialogue with everyone who's here today, both in person and online. And so to that point, I'm going to kind of shift us over to what is, I think, a very challenging question. And I don't want to make it seem like there are immediate, easy, direct solutions to the problems and the challenge that we have just been describing. However, there is just incredible experience on the panel, in the room, online. If you all would be willing to share some initial reflections on some examples of decolonial work that you think are worth mentioning, or decolonial work that is in process that is worth mentioning, or that's beginning that is worth mentioning, would love to hear a round of reactions to that. And throughout the conversation this morning, there was something that was coming up for me was there's a lot of conversation right now about inclusion. There's like the diversity, equity, and inclusion world. There's, bless you, lots of allergies today. This question of inclusion has been coming up a lot in health equity work, racial justice work, et cetera. But it's quite quite different than centering. What does it mean? What's the, this question of what's the difference between inclusion versus centering is something that I think is really potentially part of what might come up in the examples that you share today. So for this round, I'm going to ask Joseph to start, and then I'm going to pass it to Lebohang and then to Ernest, just for examples you might want to share.
Well, thanks for that. And this is where the rubber meets the road. So it's probably really important that we come up with, concrete examples that try to illustrate better what we have in mind. And I do appreciate the term centering, because a lot of the work that I do when it comes to mental health is to try to partner in collaborative fashion with tribal communities to rethink how helping services for addiction, trauma, suicide, for example, might suit populations better than the latest evidence-based practice. And so sometimes that means centering indigenous knowledges, indigenous traditions. I'll give you an example. I partnered with the Substance Abuse Treatment Program on the Blackfeet Nation, which is a reservation in Montana, and they ran their own accredited inpatient substance abuse treatment program. They also had outpatient services for their own tribal members. And I approached the director. Basically, they do what most Indian communities do, which is to import in somewhat boilerplate fashion standard residential addiction treatment. That's based on the first 5 steps of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's all about group therapy. They had a cultural counselor. They had a couple groups that addressed cultural issues. But by and large, it was brought in from the outside, and you might say dressed in beads and feathers to try to appeal to local folks, Indian folks from the state. I approached the staff and I sort of said, what would it be like to invert this method and this model? Rather than starting with something built from the outside, what about returning to Blackfeet therapeutic tradition, sorting out what that might look like, and then figuring out secondarily how to harness that for addiction treatment purposes? Well, they got quite excited about that, and we spent a couple of years coming up with a program. Essentially, the important thing about such programs is that, number one, it's deeply participatory. I think in some ways that's the major antidote to coloniality, is participatory engagement. And then really, it wasn't the addiction treatment experts who called the shots. It was community members who knew something about Blackfeet therapeutic tradition, who are not by and large credentialed as mental health people. And so these were traditional people, ceremonial people, people who kept the sacred bundles for the Blackfeet people, and what were known as the Crazy Dog Society members. What did they come up with? It took a while to get it all sorted out, but they came up with what we called the Blackfeet Culture Camp, which was an effort to, in the summertime in particular, set up a camp in teepees out in the bush and to offer to clients, addiction treatment clients, something like what their pre-reservation ancestors might have lived like. So we lived in teepees. Very first thing was to conduct a pipe ceremony after having set up the camp. The next day, the first thing was to build a sweat lodge in the bush and have a sweat lodge ceremony, and then to visit sacred sites and to harvest sacred medicines and to different things like that over the course of the remaining program. So there are a few lessons to be drawn from this example. The first is that it was sacred, not secular. That is a huge difference with mental health services in general, which are typically not sacred or not about religion, don't depend on some sense or understanding of God or other kinds of higher beings, don't depend on prayer and ceremony. Second of all, it was not led by credentialed, professional, trained people. It was led by the Crazy Dog Society. Third, it involved coming together of crazy dogs and addiction treatment clients such that no one really knew who was who. There was no clear demarcation between client and people who were putting on the program, and no one really cared about that, because in some sense people thought like this was a good program that could be therapeutically beneficial for all Blackfeet people, whether they were now contending with addiction or not. Finally, it's really important to understand it looked nothing like conventional counseling or therapy. There was no cast your feelings into words, no tell a coherent story about your life and how addiction has ruined it, no confess that you're an alcoholic, nothing like that. In fact, if anything, this was about, in some ways, not only rehabilitating a robust, positive indigenous identity, but also about connecting into socialization around ritual and traditional ceremonial practices with the crazy dogs, which in fact, sort of person by person, ends up rebuilding a nation. And so it's much bigger than treating an addiction client. It's about actually intervening in the ongoing and eventual futurity of a tribal people.
Thank you for that. Lebohang will invite you to chime in next for an example if you're ready.
Sure, I am. So I'd like to use two really briefly. So the one is around decolonizing the curriculum in South Africa. So that was the movement Fees Must Fall that I'm sure many people in the academy will have been aware of, which came to a head in 2015, spearheaded by various students across the country. And I don't want to name one or two because that also privileges one or two institutions above and beyond the rest. But the whole notion is this of what it means to be an African university that is decolonized, or what an African curriculum, and Africa not being a country, but what it would look like to see ourselves. So the demand for young people was to see themselves inside the curriculum. And this also meant that, you know, in then decolonizing the curriculum, how to then replace the kind of the canons and the assumptions about canons that have been made and taken as being. And I mean, decolonizing curricula is incredibly difficult. It's much more than just, we're not going to read Shakespeare anymore. It's also the approach, it's also the iteration, and it's also languaging, linguistic languaging, political languaging, discursive languaging, and so forth. It's the forms of learning and the forms of exchanging of knowledge, information. It is completely upending the assumption about who is a knower and who is a knowee, so to speak. And I think that what happened as a result of that is, though, even though as scholars have said, decolonization cannot be exhaustively practiced, I can point to one or two, really important examples. So one of my good friends, Professor Sipogazi Magadla, has recently supervised several students at the University of Rhodes in isiXhosa, which you'll know is one of the 9 indigenous languages of this country, minus the 2 colonial languages, including the one that I'm speaking in now. And I think that what this has done is that it has also enabled us to see and to hear and to understand and to rescue archives which are often held in language and which cannot always be found in, what has to be said, languages that came and arrived on a ship and were forced down our throat at gunpoint. The other point is that another good colleague of mine has then decided that he's retiring your classical sociological scholars. So you'd always have Weber, you would always have all of your positivist, and he is using the works of a certain guy who's one of our greatest philosophers in South Africa, and he's decided to use that as his entry point into understanding sociology from a completely different standpoint, an Afrocentric, Afro-centered, South African-centered standpoint, which then shifted around from a dead white guy in Germany or in Russia, and recenters it into realities, ontologies, which are rooted in something that is much more familiar. And I think decolonization is about a re-acclimatization of the familiar. The other thing is completely different, but it was also a series of demands by Black feminists, African feminists during the first part of the COVID pandemic, because similar to the construct of post-apartheid or post-colonialism, I don't believe that we're post-COVID either. And this was really a demand for a different kind of imagination. And I think this is where Black feminism offers a really useful approach and a reproach to colonial constructs, because we've been doing the work of reproaching the construction of states, the construction of racism, of heteronormative patriarchy for a really long time. And these demands really suggest, well, if demands can be suggestions, but these demands basically state that we want to see food sovereignty, which is rooted in indigeneity, indigenous women-led food sovereignty, tax justice, ecological work, and it's really grounded in feminist organizing and a different way of seeing and viewing and arranging power. It also suggests that the credit crisis was enormous and pervasive, and it is making demands that states, and it was actually originally written to the envoys, the African Union envoys, as appointed by current President Cyril Ramaphosa when he was the chair of the African Union, who were asked to go and look for money from the World Bank and other institutions. But basically, it was a suggestion that we need to rethink the way that credit is arranged in a ways that it actually privileges the sort of normativity of capitalism, capitalist power, and masculinized power relations, which continue to bail themselves out whilst languishing, whilst leaving the people who actually subsidize unpaid and paid or low paid labor, the Black and brown people, especially Black and brown women around the world, who actually subsidize the economies as we know them. So basically, we suggested that even though that COVID has not flattened the universe because privilege still prevailed. But what it does do is that it means that we want to see decolonized policy and power relations, and in a different manifestation of institutional and logistical arrangements in reframing the world that we want to see. Obviously, we are now living in a quasi post-COVID world. Not many of our demands were met, but I think that it's fair to say we put some hot fire under their feet for a second there.
Thank you. Hot indeed. Thank you for that. And I do hope we'll get to explore a little bit more about this question of institutional relationships that you brought up and that many of the panelists have brought up. Ernest, I'll pass it to you for a final reflection on examples.
Sure. I really appreciate Lebohang's characterization of the dialectical tension that we're in. So it has me thinking about the examples of the decoloniality side of that conversation. And neurosurgery, neurosurgery spaces have been actually historically, but not so historically, dominated by white males. It's a white male dominant space, right? And that is thanks to this incredibly successfully damaging report by Abraham Flexner and all the great money he had pumped behind it by Carnegie and Rockefeller, did a great job of keeping Blacks generally and Black males specifically outside, certainly of surgical spaces, among other medical spaces. So even going through my own residency, earlier years, I always thought to myself, it'd be wonderful to have a community of other Black neurosurgeons to connect with, to find mentorship, et cetera. Well, that finally got generated following the tragic murder of George Floyd by police officers in the way of the American Society of Black Neurosurgeons. It's only a couple of years old, but it's slow, it's coming, it's growing, and I was thrilled to discover that I wasn't the only one sort of suffering in my own thoughts about this as I went through what life was like as a neurosurgery resident. So that's one example that comes to mind. A second is the global neurosurgery field that I'm in, that probably has propelled me here, and that's part of the growing global surgery conversation. And it wasn't too long ago that the very idea of global health was sort of unwelcome in neurosurgery spaces. It's like, this has nothing to do with neurosurgery, probably for the reasons I've just mentioned. And that has shifted, and it's been powerful and it's been palpable in all areas of global surgery in general, and in global neurosurgery in particular. And at the same time, as we have pursued the conversations in the midst of that dialectical tension, we have had to face the fact that the dominant voices in global neurosurgery are the voices that have always dominated. And so it has not been as transformative as what we hoped it would be. And I think what is promising is that we are starting to talk about that, write about that, publish about it, starting to do bibliometric analyses and recognize, hey, who is the first author on these papers? Who's the anchor author on these papers? Where, how is this, where are the research questions coming from? Who benefits, et cetera, things like this, both on the research side as well as on the clinical side. And that continues. I've been fortunate enough to be part of these conversations, and they continue at our national and I would say more so international organized neurosurgery meetings, a bit more than the national ones in the US. But those conversations are alive, and they're well, and they're growing. And at least in the US, the American Society of Black Neurosurgeons is helping with our decolonial side of that tension. And then I can speak a bit more about my experiences with the Society of Haitian Neuroscientists, which is an experiment that I created after a lot of frustration dealing with the cyclical socio-political instability in Haiti and trying to build a neuroscience community there. And I thought, well, part of the problem is that so many of the Haitian neuroscientists are not in Haiti. They're like me. They are outside of Haiti. They've been driven out, or our parents have been driven out for a variety of reasons that have everything to do with this conversation. So I thought, well, what if we bring all these neuroscientists together and try to reverse the brain drain, okay? And so we've been doing that. We've been working on doing that. We have a membership of just over 100 members. All members are of Haitian nationality, ethnicity, or culture. We're in 7 different countries, and we exist to advance neuroscience in Haiti, to promote the welfare and well-being of people suffering from neurological, neurosurgical, and mental health diseases in all Haitian communities, and also to foster collaborations between Haitian neuroscientists. And within our work, much of which has been around supporting educational efforts, in the Hôpital Universitaire de Mirebalais, where there was a neurological training program. So we started to integrate our membership into the training of the residents and fellows there. And many of us started pushing education in Haitian Creole. So I won't go deeply into Haiti's socio-linguistic landscape and history, but that in and of itself was seen as a somewhat radical and Freudian move to offer education in Haitian Creole. And we've been pushing that. We've even done that with some of our new partners in Haiti, who we've met through the society. At the Association of Haitian Psychology, we partnered with them in the creation of a peace summit in the north of Haiti, and there was a lot of Haitian Creole used for everything from the neuroanatomy workshop that I taught there to a sort of reimagining of what Haitian Vodou really is about, why it's been demonized, et cetera, celebrating its fundamental cultural value and history and African cosmology, et cetera. So I'll pause there, but I think those are real examples of decoloniality.
Thank you again to the panelists for bringing the fire, the reality, the challenge. We're going to open it up for questions. We've got time for a couple of concise questions, and I see some hands already. And just a reminder, then the title of our discussion this afternoon, Decolonial Praxis and Health, Challenges and Priorities. I think we've heard a lot of the challenges. I also think we've heard a lot of incredible work that's happening that advances this vision of decoloniality in global health. So a couple of concise questions, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to close out with a minute of final reflections.
I'll make them very concise. I have one observation and one question. I just wanted to make an observation about the potential other side of conversation on decolonization from India. I live half the year in India, so I can tell you that right now an extremely right-wing government is using arguments on decolonization to actually rub out our entire Islamic history. And only last week, all the curricula in India for high school students has essentially removed 700 years of history. So I think it's an interesting counterpoint that these arguments can also be co-opted by actually extremely regressive political forces. So just to keep that in mind. My question to you is, as a member of a very privileged university here, this one that's hosting this event, I want to hear your thoughts about what is the role of privileged universities in decolonizing the praxis of global health.
So far ahead of me. I'm so glad you asked that question. That was going to be my final reflection prompt question, actually. So it's great to jump into it now, and would love reflections from the panelists. I have some thoughts too, if there's time.
I'll start. So in the Haitian community, we're very excited when we found out that Harvard's 30th president would be a Haitian American, Black Haitian American scholar. And why did it take Harvard longer to have a Black president than the United States? Right? And that's 128 years after the first PhD is awarded to another Haitian American, W.B. Du Bois, right, is how long it took for a Black president to be at the helm, which technically hasn't happened yet, right? It happens in July. And so even as we celebrate the victories, I think they should wake us up to how bad things are. And I look at the responsibility of an institution like Harvard, and there's a huge endowment for research. So I think one place to look is what are the questions that are being driven by that research endowment and supported, and who are the researchers? And I think that's a very important responsibility of the institution and the university. In addition to looking at, well, what are these structural barriers to equitable student representation in the various colleges in the university? So these are the first thoughts that come to mind.
I will briefly say that Harvard changed my life. I came here as an undergraduate, transferred as a junior, here 2 years on a Pell Grant. And so I'm forever grateful for the path it's put me on. I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't been there then, I don't think. Having said that, I'm at Harvard. I'm not entirely sure I'm of Harvard. I don't know if I'll ever be of Harvard. I don't know what it would mean for me to be of Harvard in that sense. I will say that I appreciate Harvard as a platform in which to articulate the advocacy that all of our Native and Indigenous mental health professionals bring when it comes to service delivery and funding and all the needs we have, which is to say that our traditions and our ceremonies and our cultural practices are in fact healing and part and parcel of what it looks like to help our people in a way that's anti-colonial or against the state of coloniality. And so the opportunity to say those things at a place like this is a real privilege. And it's one that I hope harnesses the concerns and commitments of my own people.
Debahang, did you want to jump in on this question, or shall we keep going? There may be an online question.
I will jump in. I will always jump in. Absolutely. So I just wanted to share something. I mean, the one is it's a quote by another great majority world scholar, Chandra Mohanty, and she says, "How does one theorize capitalist citizenship, and how is the university implicated in engendering this kind of citizenship? If the market provides the ethical and the moral framework for university life, educators and students exercise choices as consumers in a marketplace, not as citizens in a democratic polity." And then she goes on to say that thus wealth determines citizenship. Instead of people governing, markets govern. It is not the citizens who make decisions, it is consumers. So those who lack economic capacities are non-citizens. And this results in a profound recolonization of historically marginalized communities, usually poor women and people of color. And she goes on to say then that the university is basically the factory of this form of recolonization. And I think that it's fair to call, in many respects, universities like the University of Cape Town, which has recently suspended, or in fact removed, the second Black woman vice chancellor. It's fair to say that institutions like one of my alma maters, SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, have extremely complicated and very, very difficult history. And of course with Harvard, who is graciously hosting us and graciously hosting a very difficult and a very, not controversial, but a very combustible conversation that calls for great personal courage, and I think institutional courage as well. But I think that what many of these institutions have in common is that in trying to decolonize, I mean, it just seems such a capacious as to stand for any kind of critical engagement with race and representation and representativity. It does also mean that they stand on the ground physically and viscerally of a lot of settler power. So there's a debate going on at the University of Cape Town around the lands on which the university stands, right? Which is the land which was taken from many communities in that area, where they've been cordoned off over the last 100 years, and many people, marginalized or dispossessed African people in the area, are not able to access those lands. So what is the role then of a university which reinforces coloniality in its own practice, which reinforces class power and class privilege and racialized class privilege in its own practice, where many of the faculty and many of the the people, the team members, especially those who are lower paid, cannot even afford to send their own children to these institutions. And I think that the other thing is that there's a struggle to seize back a real control of all the means of what Ngugi wa Thiong'o calls communal definition. And so what does it mean then for a university like a UCT, like a Harvard, like a SOAS, like a Witwatersrand in my other alma mater in Johannesburg? What does it mean for them to grapple with the fact that many of their imprints, including their physical imprints of statues of colonizers and people like Cecil B. Rhodes, you'll probably be aware of that, Rhodes Must Fall movement, that many of these are sites of great violence, discursive violence, physical violence in many respects, at like the University of West Indies, where as our colleague Sir Hilary Beckles was telling us, several remains of our beloved loved ones who had been buried there were found as they were doing a renovation. So physical violence, and of course, intellectual violence. So it goes back to this dialectical tension for which I don't know what the resolution is, but I think that recognizing that the cure, the sickness and the cure that cannot necessarily reside with the same people in the same institutions in the same way.
Okay, well, I think we've thoroughly explored that question, and there's a lot more that could be said. I did say we would do 2 questions, so I think there is one online question that we'll take, and what I'll do is, we won't have time to have the whole panelist group answer this question. What I might do is just ask you to integrate any reflections, the answer to the question, into your closing 30 to 60 second thoughts. So one question from online.
Hi, yes, thank you. This is a question from students in our virtual audience. How do you foresee the next generation of global health scholars carrying out decolonial praxis? What is the role of young people in pursuing these challenging equitable solutions in medicine, political economies, etc.?
All right, what a beautiful question. Thank you to the online folks for submitting that one, and what an exciting opportunity to think about the future. So for closing remarks, partially or not in response to this question, I'm gonna actually ask Lebohang to start us off, and then I'll go to Ernst and then to Joseph, just a brief closing reflection for us.
Thanks. I think I'm the only sort of civilian in that I'm not a health practitioner. On this panel, I'm a social scientist, but I'm very interested in the notion of how health and the exclusion and the exclusionary nature of public health manifested itself over the last 3 years during the the earlier phase of the COVID pandemic. And I think that it gives us the opportunity to really reframe and to rethink the power of biopolitics, right? The power of bioimperialism and biocolonialism, and how these actually then aggregate to then contribute to the notion of who is and is not worthy, right? Who and the notion of personhood, which I think medical practice is also extremely concerned with, the notion of the sanctity and the sacredness of life, all lives, right? And that this cannot be mediated by economic access, racial access, by geographic access, by majority world versus minority world interests. And I think also to add that, all of this is linked to the racialization of capital, the racialization of who accesses markets, and the racialization and gendered access to those markets, and the right to be fully human. That is what I think really seems to emerge as well, even as we speak of coloniality and decoloniality. It comes down to the question of who is and is not human, and how has white supremacist power framed this hierarchy of humanity. So I suppose I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you. Ernest?
Thank you. Great question from the students. And I keep bringing back the idea of dialectical tension, and I would suggest how important it is for us to therefore create spaces for conversations like this, and also consider the importance of deep introspection in these conversations and situating oneself, understand who are you in this conversation, by accident of birth, by accident of, where you grew up, things like this, and how might that shape the way you even listen when you're out there listening? Because listening, I think, is the key skill that the global health leader of the future wants to develop, and frankly, the leader of the future wants to develop, is the ability to deeply listen. And deeply listening requires you to recognize what gets in the way of working constructively with your partners wherever they are. So I think, consider this in your professional development, and then I'm going to borrow what I believe I heard from Dr. Anna Christina a bit earlier, around the possibility of learning from the global South. I think it's more than a possibility. I think it's very real. And even ask yourself, why is that such an audacious statement to make, right? And we want to move towards recognizing, no, that's exactly where we're going to figure out how to solve this. Like, we don't have what it takes, sitting up in ivory towers looking down, and trying to solve these problems, because that is the colonial side of this dialectical tension. We've got to really get outside of this matrix and start learning from people who really need to be the empowered and leading voices in this conversation.
Joseph.
Thank you. I love the question, and so it's a nice opportunity to reflect on it a little bit. One thing that has occurred to me in the work that I've done is that in some cases, the exact same program or intervention might be colonial or decolonial, depending on how it was arrived at and who had a say in its organization and deployment. And so I just want to underscore, I think what others are saying is that I do think that a participatory approach that depends sort of on a relational ethos is the way of the future and the way that decoloniality can be advanced. Certainly you have expertise. It would be foolish to imagine you would get into a field without any meaningful, useful expertise. The thing is, lots of people have expertise, and you don't have to have advanced degrees and have gone to Harvard to have expertise. There are people in our communities who have all kinds of expertise that has no credential and not even any acknowledgement or recognition from the broader society. And for these programs and interventions, whatever we have to contribute, to be relevant and useful and harnessed to ameliorate suffering and help our peoples, requires all of the expertise on the table and people in dialogue and a negotiated and well-reasoned effort to figure out how to apply this to that setting and this problem in this way. And so I just think the participatory approach is what needs to be underscored. I'm a little hopeful because the National Institutes of Health in the United States, at least some of the institutes, have had calls for research that fund some of the participatory part. I mean, the major problem is that usually grants don't pay for before the beginning kind of work, where you set up the partnership, where you would host a community advisory board, where you get the feedback and even consultation about what should the research question be, what methods are acceptable, what methods aren't, what would work best or meet the needs of this community best. And if no one's funding that, well, then it's not surprising that it's not happening. But some people are funding it at NIH, and probably it needs to become more the wave of the future, not just at NIH in the United States, but around the world. Thanks.
Incredible, incredible. Thank you. I'll just close by saying another word of appreciation to the panelists for bringing such direct, fiery, critical, honest reflections. We mentioned and talked about participatory engagement, sacred, not secular, familiarity. We talked about endowments and how they could be used. And I just think I would leave us with this question again of what is our responsibility for those of us as individuals, as members of elite institutions, for those of us who have and hold those identities. The question of partnership, I think, comes up over and over again, and that was a big question in the conversations this morning as well. Where do they start? where do they originate? How are they framed? What are the goals? Whose voice is centered? I think these are all questions that we can continue to grapple with as we reflect on what decoloniality might look like in global health. And the final thing I'll say, to go back to what Lebohang mentioned about Black feminism, Bell Hooks said, we cannot cede the space to the fools, so let's keep pushing our institutions to do better. Thank you again.